because that is true, because they are three-dimensional molecules. You have to get out of the habit of thinking of them as flat and two-dimensional, because sometimes it's really necessary in your mind's eye to rotate them and say, where is actually the shortest carbon, or where does this functional group actually hook up? To really know that, to really understand that, to really get that, you need to be able to think three-dimensionally. And so I've deliberately tried to add tools inside the video that I was not able to show during the Zoom conference, things which are more three-dimensional to help you get that understanding. So that's what I would do first. Now, that's what we've done before, you know, organic compounds, structure of carbon, learn how to make simple hydrocarbon chains, basic IUPAC naming rules, everything that's on page 1 and 2 of the Organic Compound Guide. And if you didn't come to one or more Zoom conferences, well, use the video I've given you, use the Organic Compound Guide, and just go through that material. Don't worry about anything else until you've done that, until you really feel like you have a mastery of that material. Because there's literally 3 separate assignments that it's helpful to have that Organic Compound Guide at your fingertips in order to do it. And if you haven't really mastered the Organic Compound Guide, you may not get much out of doing the assignments. It may become very difficult for you to do the assignments. I even tell you this in the video. At the end of the video, I stress you really should do this first. So if you haven't, do that. Now, having said that, I am now ready to go on and do new material. So here we go. So we've been talking about the variety that carbon is capable of, how you can make so many different shapes out of carbon-based molecules. And you see a whole bunch of different shapes here. These are all carbon-based molecules. So for example, this right here is a sugar. It's a six carbon sugar. And the corners of the hexagon represent the carbons, and the things coming off the corners, represent molecules attached to those carbons. This is actually a simple sugar by itself, a monosaccharide. And you know what? This monosaccharide by itself is interesting, but you can chain them up. You can use this monosaccharide as a building block to make something else. Or we have this thing right here. It's got an amine group on one side. This is one of the functional groups on your Organic Compound Study Guide. It's got a carboxylic acid here. That's another functional group, also on your organic guide. In the middle, it's got a central carbon, and this is a fairly complex shape. And this is also a building block. You can take one of these and chain a whole bunch of these up and make something. Or you could have a chain of 1, 2, 3 carbons. You could have a chain of 1, 2, 3 carbons here, and each carbon would have an alcohol group attached to it. And on the opposite side, you could have something else attached to these carbons. Because remember that each of these carbons can be hooked to as many as 4 different items. So there's room to attach things here. So you could take a bunch of these and you could chain these all up. So every one of these things is complex by itself, but the next level of complexity is truly where life gets an extra boost, you might say, because each of these building blocks can be used to make long chains of other things. And we have a building block like this, it's called a monomer, and we chain them up. The chain that we produce is called a polymer. Now, I want to be very clear with you here. I've tried to talk and give you a clue that there's a reason why life is based upon carbon. Life is a complex phenomenon. Living things are really complex. There is no structure in the known universe more complicated, for example, than the human brain. There might be something more complicated elsewhere, but the most complicated thing we've ever discovered is the human brain. More so than any machine we've ever built, including the most powerful supercomputers. The information that assembles that complex object of the human brain is information that partly comes from the genes that are inside our bodies. And those genes are basically just stored on chemicals. The little chemicals inside that make up our genes actually store the information. and they have the ability to express that information. And when they express that information, ladies and gentlemen, they express that information largely to build other molecules, because these molecules are not random. When we talked about thermodynamics, that branch of biology that deals with heat, thermodynamics has a bunch of laws in it, and the laws are kind of disturbing. The laws say things like, you know, the universe is running out of energy, it's getting colder. They say things like, you know, anything that's complicated is going to tend to break down and fall apart. These are negative sounding things. And so the existence of really large, complex molecules like this you see here in this screen, those molecules are real. They're based upon carbon, and they are going in the opposite direction of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics says for the universe as a whole, we're running out of complexity. We're running out of available energy. But here on Earth, we have a local surplus of energy, and we're going in the opposite direction. We use the local surplus, that in our neck of the woods, we have a lot of energy available from the sun. We use that local surplus to build astonishingly complex systems through carbon-based molecules. And the place where we get the most bang is here in polymerization. We take these simple building blocks and we chain them up to make things as big and as complicated as we need to do the chemical reactions and build the structures we need to survive. And so this is really the cool piece. This is like the greatest secret in life. And the greatest secret in life is actually a piece of chemistry: polymerization. So macromolecules. Macromolecules is a general term. You know, molecules by their name suggest things that are small, and most macromolecules are very, very, very small. But in biochemistry, the molecules do get to be larger, more complex. And so we sometimes call these really large, complex molecules in biology, we call them macromolecules. Macro means larger, right? And so we have four main classes of relatively large molecules, and every one of these classes is based on carbon. It's not an accident. And every one of these large molecules isn't formed all at once. Instead, they are built up from the little building blocks. We do polymerization reactions from characteristic monomers. So there's a category called carbohydrates. And an example of a carbohydrate monomer is a simple sugar like a monosaccharide. Chain enough of these up and you make some carbs. We have lipids. An example of a lipid monomer is what's called a triglyceride. I'll be showing this to you. These are amazingly simple molecules. They have a shape kind of like a pick comb, and it allows them to do so many cool and interesting and important things. Then, perhaps most amazing of all is the proteins. This standard little building block called an amino acid, we can chain this sucker up any way we want to make a protein that's as big and as complicated as we need for whatever functions we need. Finally, to carry the information, to store the information that's needed to build all these other things, we have a special category of carbon-based macromolecules, the nucleic acids. That's DNA and RNA. And these molecules, much simpler than proteins and often simpler than carbohydrates, these molecules have the ability to carry a code, and the code carries part of the information that's used to assemble a living thing. It's really cool stuff. So here we go. Atoms combine through chemical bonds. We know that. They could be ionic bonds, they could be covalent bonds. Ionic bonds are weak, easy to make, easy to break. The covalent bonds are enduring. We need both kinds of bonds for life. We need covalent bonds that endure to build stable structures. Like, I don't want to stick my hand in water, my hand dissolves like the Wicked Witch of the West. My hand needs to be tougher than water. It needs to survive that. But we also need to be able to do chemical reactions that take very little energy to do, to carry other kinds of information. And that's where the ionic compounds come in. But we have to do both. Now, ionic compounds are usually not based on carbon, whereas the covalent compounds that we use in living things are almost always based on carbon. Since we have some things that are with carbon, some that are without carbon, we need to be able to talk about that. So we say that if it's without carbon, we call it an inorganic compound. But if it's based on carbon, we say it's an organic compound. And again, the four categories of macromolecules based upon carbon are carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So this kind of recapitulates the scheme. Up here, this is physics. Right here, this is chemistry. And this stuff, this is the chemistry of life. These are the substances that life does its bit with. So carbohydrates, what are they? Well, they are substances that are found in the cell walls of plants like cellulose, or in the external skeletons of insects like chitin. They are a source of quick energy. The chocolate in this candy bar, the syrup in the Coca-Cola, the foam, because that's what a corn chip is. A corn chip, a Dorito, is just a kind of foam. They're all ways of presenting chains of carbohydrates. And so they are all sources of quick energy. Why are they sources of quick energy? It's because they're not just made of carbon and hydrogen like the hydrocarbons are. Hydrocarbons are just hydrogen and carbon, but carbohydrates are carbon and the building blocks of water. Since carbohydrates actually have the building blocks of water, hydrogen, oxygen in them, hey, guess what? They'll dissolve in water. So they are polar compounds. An individual sugar is called a monosaccharide. We often represent a monosaccharide with a polygon. If it's a 5-carbon sugar, it's a pentagon. If it's a 6-carbon sugar like glucose, it's a hexagon. And if we chain a whole bunch of those monosaccharides together, we make a long chain of these sugars. We call it a polysaccharide. Poly, a prefix, it means many. And there's all kinds of polymers that are just chains of repeating the same sugar over and over again. Now, lipids, just like carbohydrates, are also made of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But the difference is the hydrogens and the oxygens are arranged in a different way where it's harder for the water to get at. The hydrogens by themselves are very difficult to get at, and the oxygens, they're easier to get at, but they're still not very convenient. And so lipids will not readily dissolve in water. They will never completely dissolve in water on their own. You have to do some chemistry on them to get them to dissolve. And so whereas carbohydrates are polar, will dissolve in water, lipids are non-polar. And you're not going to be surprised to learn that lipids includes things like fats, waxes, and oils, because we already know that oil and water don't mix. Butter is a fat. A candle is wax. And olive oil, of course, is an oil. Now, lipids have a bad reputation because we think of them as fat, and nobody wants to be unattractive or unhealthy, and excess fat can make us feel unattractive, and they can definitely make us unhealthy. That said, a zero-fat diet is a terrible idea, especially for you young people. You do not want to have a zero-fat diet, trust me, because you need a small amount of fat in your diet to do certain things. For example, if you're making new cells, you got to have a little fat, because the molecules that make up cell membranes that hold the whole cell together, they're basically fat molecules. They're molecules that the heads point out towards water outside the cell, or they point in towards water that's inside the cell. And in between, there's these fatty acid tails. Oh, they don't like water. These are molecules that automatically arrange themselves in such a way that they try to get away from water. And they make our cell membranes that hold our cells together possible. Also, fats are useful for long-term energy storage. Carbs are good for quick energy, but you don't get a lot of energy. You mostly, right? You don't get a lot. You just get it quick. Whereas with fat, you can store energy long-term more efficiently. So there's a plus there. Finally, fats are used to make what are called hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers, and most hormones are made out of lipid molecules. Why? Because most hormones are going to be carried through the bloodstream. If we made our hormones out of nucleic acids or carbohydrates or even proteins, they would tend to dissolve. That's no good. Well, it's no good to send a message and the halfway there your letter dissolves, right? So we actually use lipids because they will not dissolve in water. They will not dissolve in the blood, and you'll make the hormone once and it'll do its job millions of times over and over again inside the bloodstream before it wears out. And that's why the hormones that cause us to mature, cholesterol, testosterone, androgens, they're steroid hormones. with no lipids in your diet, you might not develop to be the man or woman you're meant to be. So make sure you don't go on the zero fat diet unless a physician says you have to, because usually the zero fat diet is actually unhealthy. The most characteristic form of lipids are monomers called fatty acids. These are simply chains of carbons surrounded by hydrogens. They're very similar to hydrocarbons. They're very similar. But to stabilize themselves, they're often bound in groups of 3 to what's called a glycerol molecule. The glycerol has one part of the molecule which is polar and will point toward water. It has 3 alcohol groups, and it has another part which is fatty acid chains, and they hate water. And these molecules are a very common way to store fat. You see it packs nice and tightly. It's very efficiently. Also, these molecules are useful not only for building cell membranes, but they're useful for cleaning things. We use the molecules like this all the time in soaps. If you've ever tried to clean something that's got fat or oil on it, and just by adding water, you know that you make more of a mess than you do than if you don't add water. That's because, fat doesn't like water. Water won't grab it. But a molecule like this, a triglyceride, is like a little comb. You can think of the glycerol highlighted in purple like the handle of the comb. You can think of the fatty acids highlighted in green as like the picks or the teeth of the comb. So when you add a soap to water where you're trying to clean some, say, bacon grease off a pan, the water grabs the glycerol. The glycerol pushes the fatty acids, which are like little brushes, and they grab onto pieces of fat, start breaking up the fat into smaller chunks. That's why soap works. It's like a molecular go-between, because one side is polar and will accept water, and the other side is non-polar, and it won't like water, but it sure will grab fat, and that's the key. I need to quickly do this because this is related to hydrocarbons. We should have learned that hydrocarbons are saturated. That is, if you have a chain where every carbon has 4 separate partners with 4 separate bonds, it's bound to as many other atoms as possible, then we say that chain is saturated. And so there are versions of lipids that are based upon saturated hydrocarbons, and we call them saturated fats because they're bound to as many hydrogens as possible. And as you can see, these chains tend to stay straight. But if we replace some of the single bonds with double bonds, then the chains won't stay straight. They won't stay straight because the double bonds will pull harder than the single bonds. And so the chains, instead of staying straight, will spread out, become a little tangled. And this makes all the difference in our diet. Saturated fats like butter, they'll tend to pack more efficient. They'll tend to stay solid at room temperature because their chains stay straight. Whereas unsaturated fats, like vegetable oils, that have these extra double bonds, their chains won't stay straight because the forces aren't even, and because they won't stay straight, they'll spread out, which means at room temperature, they tend to get warmer faster, they spread out, and instead of being a solid, they become a liquid. If you've ever wondered why butter is a fat that's solid and vegetable oil is, a liquid, this is why. Butter is mostly saturated fat, just like the fat in meat is mostly saturated fats, whereas oils are unsaturated fats and tend to be liquids at room temperature. Okay, going on to proteins. Proteins are formed from subunits which are called amino acids. You'll notice we have some shaded regions. Each of the shaded regions is a different functional group. So if you haven't cracked open that organic compound guide, if you're not still sure what a functional group is, to understand a protein, you need to know that the building blocks on it, they in turn have little regions, subregions that are functional groups, and these really matter. Proteins are primarily based on the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen. Nitrogen plays an important role in every amino acid, and a few amino acids also have sulfurs. They have what are called sulfhydryl groups or sulfurs side chains in 4 of the amino acids, but all the amino acids also have nitrogen. So right off the bat there, protein's a little bit more complicated in terms of their building block. These proteins are often very large. As molecules go, they can be very large, and they come in an almost unlimited number of different shapes. Practically speaking, protein, the variety of proteins, it is an inexhaustible resource. If you can figure out what shape you want, you can make a protein that matches that shape. I am not kidding. It doesn't matter what the shape is. If you can figure out what shape you want, and you can figure out what order you need to build the protein to get that shape, then you can make any protein for any shape. That's probably the single most important problem we're trying to solve in biochemistry. It's called the protein folding problem. More on that in a moment. Now, the amino acid, there are a lot of them. There are hundreds, but it turns out that while there are hundreds of amino acids, in practice, people rarely need to know hundreds. They usually memorize the names and properties of about 20 of them, because this same group of 20 amino acids is used by all living things. Again, it's kind of like having a set of Legos, and you have a bunch of different colors and shapes of Legos, and you can chain them up any way you want to make any shape you want to, but you start with the same group of basic shapes. Well, with amino acids, there's 20 shapes used by living things. But each one of these amino acids has a different shape, but they have common features. For example, even though they have different shapes, they all will have what's called an amine group, NH2, highlighted in green. They'll all have a carboxylic acid group, COOH, with a double bond, highlighted in blue. And then they'll have a variable R group. Now, look carefully at this. There is no element R. There's radium is Ra, and radon is Rn, and rutherfordium is Rf, and so on and so forth. But there's no element just with R. So this R doesn't stand for an element. Instead, it stands for replaceable, a replacement, because the R group is variable. On each of the 20 amino acids, they have something different at the R. Every amino acid has the same exact structure on top, the green and the blue and this region in the middle. Where they vary is the pink region, which we call the R group. Now, here's an example of this. We can have amino acids that have the same basic structure, but they have different R groups. So this one has a methyl group, whereas this one has methanol. It's slightly different, so they have a slightly different shape here. And that will affect how the protein folds up. Because once this protein is chained up, we'll have a long chain, and you can think of it almost like a charm necklace. You'll be able to see here that we have a series of amino acids, and on the top, their structure is exactly the same. But on the bottom, they have different shapes, like charms on a charm bracelet. And you can make the bracelet as long as you want to. You can put on as many charms as you want to in any order that you want. But no matter what it is, the chain that you build, you eventually have to fold up. When you fold up this polypeptide chain, you're going to be folding it in the order it was created. So here's a graphic that shows the order of amino acids in a polypeptide chain. The numbers, the letters, the symbols, and the colored regions represent different amino acids organized by different domains. It's very complicated. It doesn't actually look like this. This is just a diagram to express the order of the amino acid sequence. And this amino acid sequence is more than 810 amino acids long. Most simple proteins are 600 to 800 amino acids long. So these are relatively large, and if you change the order of the sequence just a little bit, you're going to change the way it folds up. And if you change the way it folds up, my friends, that changes the final folded shape you get. The sequence of amino acids determines the final folded shape of the chain, and that final folded shape determines its function, because most of these proteins are going to have a specific shape as part of their structure, and that specific shape allows it to do something, build something, or make something else. It's really that simple. Now, to express all of this information, because I hope you realize that these things don't happen by accident, right? The carbohydrates don't chain themselves up. The triglycerides aren't manufactured naturally through some process. And certainly the complex, sequence of amino acids that's built up to make a gigantic protein, that's definitely not a random event. These are non-random events. And it takes information to make something non-random happen. You got to have instructions. Nucleic acids are the category of macromolecules that carry and express the information as the living thing builds and constantly rebuilds its body. Nucleic acids have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, just like proteins, but a big difference is they also use phosphate groups as part of their structure, and so they use the element phosphorus. Nucleic acids were first discovered in the cell nucleus. We now know that they're inside there in order to store information. That's a safe place to store the information. We know that nucleic acids are made of building blocks, monomers, that are called nucleotides. And of course, they include DNA and RNA. Now, the fact of the matter is that in order to do chemical reactions, you either have to make macromolecules or you have to break them. When I take in food, when I eat food, the food already has carbs and proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids in it. The food already has DNA in it. When you guys eat food, especially fresh fruit, that's just been harvested, just been prepared, there's plenty of DNA in there and you're eating it. There's plenty of carbs there, protein, lipids, the whole works. They're in there. And they're all chained up. And as long as they're chained up, you can't use them. So the process of digestion inside our bodies is a series of steps where we chemically break down the macromolecules that are in our food. We do digestion on the proteins, the carbs, the lipids. We break it down. Digestion is complicated because you need different kinds of chemical processes to break down a protein than you need to break down fat. Carb digestion starts in the mouth with a simple enzyme plus a little water. There's lots of carbs that melt in your mouth. You don't have to swallow them to start digesting them, right? M&Ms, bread, anything in liquid form. Other things, especially proteins, you have to do protein digestion starting in the stomach. You're going to need some high level of acid. You're going to need specific enzymes that are designed to break down proteins. And then fat digestion, well, there's a reason why you've got organs like, the gallbladder and the liver and the lower intestine. They do different kinds of chemical reactions and they can break down molecules that are largely based upon fat, okay? So we have to digest them. Now, once we digest them, we have all the little building blocks are still floating around. After we break the chains, the individual building blocks are still there. Individual sugars are still in the bloodstream. Individual amino acids are still in the bloodstream, and so on and so forth. And what our body does is we take the energy that we get from breaking down the food, breaking the chemical bonds that held the chains together. We take the energy from breaking down the chains and we use that energy to take those building blocks that we just brought into our body, and we either get rid of them as waste, or we take some of them and we take those building blocks and we just use them to build new polymer chains, new large molecules for our purposes. And that's the secret. Before I challenge you to try to understand why I said carbon was the shape of life, why is that? Why is it I said that life, if it's elsewhere in the universe, is likely based upon carbon? And I gave you part of the answer when I explained that carbon, because of its balanced structure, 4 and 4, has a unique ability to make shapes. There are other low mass elements that are plentiful in the universe, but the problem with them is that their outer structure is not balanced. Instead of having 4 filled spaces and 4 empty spaces pulling on each other with the same amount of force, you'll have things that aren't balanced. Like oxygen's got 6 spaces filled and 2 empty spaces. And it just wants those empty spaces filled. And so instead of trying to hook up with other atoms, it often just adds electrons to fill that space. And so instead of having regular standard neutral oxygen, you've got an oxygen ion that's -2. And that oxygen ion is not going to build large covalent structures. It's going to be attracted to particles of opposite charge. It's going to do different things. The bottom line is this. Most of the covalent compounds are going to be based upon carbon, because carbon alone of the low mass elements has the right balance of filled and unfilled spaces that it can focus on building larger and larger molecules. The other compounds are going to tend to become positive or negatively charged. They'll do ionic bonds, but they usually won't do covalent bonds on their own. Thus, if you want to build a living thing, you need something that will carry a lot of information. And the only molecules that are likely to be available to carry a lot of information are the ones that have a lot of different shapes, because they have the biggest alphabet. When we say that we have 20 amino acids, that's kind of like saying we've got 20 letters in our protein building alphabet. And when we say DNA has 4 bases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, when we say that, we're saying that there are 4 different letters in the language of DNA, which gets translated into the language of protein, which gets then expressed in a variety of ways in the living cell. So you just can't build a living thing unless you're able to express a lot of information, a lot of complex information. And carbon, of all this low mass elements in the universe, is best able to build up complex structures, able to carry a code, able to express and store and transmit information from one generation to the next. And that's why carbon is the shape of life. And that's why, if there's life elsewhere in the universe, it probably uses very similar molecules based upon the same kind of carbon chains that we see on Earth, because it's the one common element in the universe that's likely to be able to do those things necessary.